For years, I sent my parents money, never questioning where it was going, never asking for details, never once assuming that they were doing anything other than using it to live comfortably. Every month, without fail, I wired them exactly what they needed, covered the occasional unexpected expense, and made sure they never had to worry about things like rent, groceries, or medical bills. I did it out of love, out of obligation, out of some deep-seated need to make sure they had a better life than they would have if they had to rely on their own dwindling savings. I did it because I thought I was helping them retire in peace, thought I was giving back to the people who had raised me, thought I was making sure they never struggled. It never once occurred to me to check where the money was going. I never questioned why they never seemed to need less, never wondered why no matter how much I sent, it was always barely enough, never considered the possibility that there was more to this arrangement than I had been led to believe. After all, they never asked for anything directly, never called me in desperation, never made it seem like they were on the edge of losing everything. If anything, they always sounded fine, always reassured me that they were doing okay, always insisted that they appreciated what I was doing but would be just fine even if I couldn't help as much one month. It was subtle, the way they framed it, the way they never outright demanded money but never turned it down either, the way they let me believe this was all my choice, all my decision, all something I had freely given. And then, one day, everything changed. It started with something small, something that shouldn't have even mattered, something that should have gone unnoticed in the grand scheme of things. I was paying off a few bills, going through my own finances, making sure everything was in order, when I noticed a charge that didn't make sense. It was linked to my parents' bank account, an account I occasionally helped manage since they weren't as tech-savvy as they used to be, an account I had assumed was only used for necessities. But there it was, clear as day, a transfer, a sizable one, made directly to my sister, Lauren. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they had loaned her a little bit. Maybe she had needed help with something unexpected. Maybe there was some logical explanation that I just wasn't seeing. I told myself it was nothing, told myself I was overthinking it, told myself there was no way my parents had been secretly funneling my money into my sister's bank account behind my back. But then I looked closer, started checking the statements, started digging into the numbers, started noticing a pattern I couldn't ignore. Every month, like clockwork, right after my transfer hit their account, a large chunk of it was sent straight to Lauren.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It wasn't a loan. It wasn't a one-time favor. It was every single month. My money, the money I had sent to make sure my parents never struggled, was not being used for their expenses. It wasn't going toward their rent, their groceries, their medical bills. It was going straight to Lauren, the golden child, the sister who had never worked a real job, the sister who had spent her entire life getting everything handed to her on a silver platter. And she wasn't just taking the money, she was spending it. There were records of shopping sprees, designer handbags, expensive meals at restaurants I had never even stepped foot in, vacations to places I hadn't even known she had visited. She was living like someone who had a steady income, like someone who had earned the money she was throwing around, like someone who had absolutely no idea that the lifestyle she had been enjoying wasn't being funded by her own hard work, but by me. The realization hit me so hard that for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers numb as they hovered over the keyboard. I had been played, lied to, used not just by my sister, but by my parents, the people I had trusted, the people I had believed would never take advantage of me like this. And the worst part? They hadn't even thought I would find out. I didn't wait, didn't second-guess myself, didn't try to convince myself there had to be some logical explanation for why my parents had been sending my money to my sister every single month. Instead, I grabbed my phone, took a deep breath, and called them, my hands shaking as I listened to the line ring, my stomach twisting into knots, my heartbeat pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't just about the money, wasn't just about the fact that they had lied to me, wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about everything it represented, about the undeniable proof that I had never been their priority. About the realization that no matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough. When my mother finally answered, her voice was light, cheerful, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Rachel, sweetheart." "What a nice surprise," she said, her tone dripping with the same warmth she always used when she wanted something, the same voice that had once convinced me she appreciated everything I did. I didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't bother pretending I was calling for a casual chat, didn't let her control the conversation the way she always had. "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, my grip tightening around the phone as I tried to keep my emotions in check. There was a pause, a slight hesitation, like she could sense that something was wrong. "Of course, honey," she said, her voice still sweet, but now tinged with caution. "What's on your mind?" I took another deep breath, steadying myself before delivering the question that would change everything. "Where is my money going?" Silence. Not the confused, surprised silence of someone who genuinely had no idea what I was talking about, not the innocent silence of a person caught off guard, but the guilty silence of someone who had been caught in a lie. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was different, tighter, guarded. "Rachel, I don't know what you mean," she said, but I could hear the nervous edge creeping into her tone, could hear the way she was already trying to find a way out of this, already trying to spin the story into something she could control. I didn't let her. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice low, my patience already gone. "I checked the bank records. I know you've been sending the money to Lauren. I know that every single month you take what I send and hand it over to her. So don't sit there and pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Another long silence. Then, instead of guilt, instead of remorse, instead of the apology I had foolishly expected, my mother let out a sharp breath and said the words that made my blood run cold. "She needed it more than you." I felt my entire body go still, my grip on the phone tightening so much my fingers ached, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and pure, blinding rage. "What?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, because surely I had misheard her, surely she wasn't actually saying what I thought she was saying. "You're doing fine, Rachel," she said, her voice firmer now, like she had decided that this was her defense, like she had convinced herself that saying it with confidence would make it true. "You have a good job, a stable life, a career. You don't need the money like she does. Lauren, she's not as strong as you are." I felt something inside me snap. Lauren wasn't as strong as me? The same Lauren who had never worked a full-time job, the same Lauren who spent her days shopping, traveling, living off other people's generosity, the same Lauren who had never once struggled a day in her life. I had worked for everything I had sacrificed, had built myself up from nothing, had spent years grinding my way through long hours and late nights to make sure I never had to rely on anyone. But instead of acknowledging that, instead of being proud, instead of appreciating everything I had done for them, they had looked at me and decided I was too strong to need their love. And the worst part? Lauren knew. She had known this whole time, had known exactly where the money was coming from, had known exactly what our parents were doing, had known that I was the one keeping her afloat, and she had never once said a word. Instead, she had bragged about it, had posted pictures from her vacations, had laughed about how lucky she was, had never once stopped to consider that her entire lifestyle was being funded by someone who had no idea she was paying for it. I could feel my mother still talking, still trying to justify it, still trying to make it sound like this was all normal, like this was just what families did. But I wasn't listening anymore, wasn't hearing anything other than the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears, wasn't thinking about anything other than the cold, hard truth staring me in the face. They had never cared about me the way they cared about her. They had never seen me the way they saw her. They had never chosen me. And now, for the first time in my life, I was going to choose myself. I took a slow breath, steadying my voice, forcing every ounce of emotion out of it, making sure that when I spoke, there was no hesitation, no weakness, no room for argument. "I'm done," I said, the words sharp, final, absolute. "I'm cutting you off. No more money, no more support, No more helping you fund Lauren's life while I work for everything on my own. If she needs money so badly, let her figure it out. Just like I had to. My mother's breath caught, and for the first time, there was real panic in her voice. Rachel, wait, I hung up. And just like that, it was over. I didn't hesitate, didn't sit around wondering if I was making the right decision, didn't let guilt creep in the way it might have in the past. Instead, I logged into my bank account, went straight to the automatic transfers, and shut it all down. Every single recurring payment, every scheduled wire, every financial door they had grown so comfortable walking through, I slammed them shut without a second thought. I transferred the remaining funds in the joint account I had access to back to my own personal savings, making sure there wasn't a single dollar left for them to touch, for them to funnel into Lauren's hands, for them to waste on anything other than their own responsibilities. And then I sat back, staring at the screen, waiting for the fallout to begin. It didn't take long. My phone rang almost immediately, the name Mom flashing across the screen, her persistence so predictable I almost laughed. I let it ring, let it vibrate angrily against the table, let her sit there on the other end wondering if I would pick up, wondering if I would break, wondering if I still had that tiny shred of weakness she had relied on for so long. When the call finally went to voicemail, she called again. And then again. Then came the texts. Mom, Rachel, what is going on? The bank just called me, and they said the transfer didn't go through. Call me right now. Mom, you can't just do this without talking to us first. We need to discuss this like a family. Mom, Rachel, please answer the phone. We don't understand why you're doing this. I exhaled slowly, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me, an unfamiliar but incredibly satisfying weight lifting from my chest as I stared at the messages, letting the reality of it all sink in. They didn't understand why I was doing this? They understood perfectly. They just didn't want to admit it. They didn't want to say the words out loud, didn't want to acknowledge that they had pushed me to this point, didn't want to face the truth that they had broken something that could never be repaired. And still, despite everything, there was no apology. Not a single word acknowledging what they had done, not a single moment of regret, not a single ounce of guilt, just panic, just outrage, just the sheer disbelief that their free ride had finally ended. Then, as expected, came Lauren. But unlike my mother, who at least tried to pretend she wasn't furious, Lauren didn't even bother hiding her anger. Lauren, WTF, Rachel? Mom just called me freaking out. Did you seriously just cut them off like that? Lauren, you're being a total bitch right now. Do you even care what happens to them? Lauren, you're literally ruining their lives. Do you even care? I smiled to myself, shaking my head slightly as I read the messages, my fingers tightening around my phone as I debated whether or not to reply. But before I could even decide, she sent another one this time, far more honest than the others. Lauren, how the hell am I supposed to pay rent now? And there it was. The truth. It wasn't about our parents, wasn't about their well-being, wasn't about the fact that I had stopped supporting them. It was about the fact that she had just lost her income, the income that had never belonged to her in the first place. The money she had never earned, the money she had grown so used to taking that she had convinced herself she was entitled to it. I locked my phone, tossed it onto the table, and leaned back, closing my eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of it all settle, letting the realization wash over me that for the first time in years, I was finally free. No more phone calls begging for money, no more fake gratitude, no more feeling like my entire existence revolved around keeping them afloat. I had spent so long believing that I was doing the right thing, that I was helping, that I was taking care of my family the way a daughter was supposed to. But I hadn't been taking care of my family. I had been funding their lies. Days passed. The messages slowed down. The calls became less frequent. And slowly, the silence grew. A silence that once would have terrified me, that once would have sent me spiraling into guilt, but now it felt like peace. And then, late one night, there was a knock on my door. It was sharp, urgent, the kind of knock that sent a chill down your spine, the kind of knock that told you the person on the other side wasn't there to chat, wasn't there to be polite, wasn't there because they had good news. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, my fingers hovering over the doorknob, already knowing exactly who it was before I even looked through the peephole. And I was right. It was Lauren. And for the first time in her life, she looked desperate. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers wrapped loosely around the doorknob, my breath steady, my heart calm in a way that surprised even me. On the other side of the door was Lauren, but not the Lauren I had grown up with, not the sister who had always worn an air of entitlement like a second skin, not the woman who had coasted through life without a single consequence ever touching her. No, the person standing there now, the one whose silhouette was barely visible through the peephole, the one shifting from foot to foot like she wasn't sure whether she should be here or not, the one who had pounded on my door like her life depended on it, was someone else entirely. I took my time opening the door, letting her wait, letting her wonder, letting her sit in the anxiety of not knowing whether I would answer at all. Then, finally, I turned the knob and pulled it open, standing face to face with a very different Lauren, one I barely recognized, one who no longer carried herself with the smug confidence she had always used as a shield. Her hair was messy, thrown into a careless bun that still had the remnants of what must have been a week-old salon treatment gone wrong, her makeup smudged, her eyes red-rimmed, her lips pressed together so tightly that for a moment, I thought she might actually cry before she even got a single word out. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest, letting my gaze sweep over her, taking in the subtle details of her unraveling, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands twitched at her sides, the barely contained frustration that was practically rolling off of her in waves. She was trying to hold it together, trying to pretend she wasn't breaking, but it was clear as day Lauren was falling apart. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then let out a sharp breath through her nose, her jaw clenching as if she was fighting the urge to scream at me instead of talk. Finally, with her voice shaking just enough to betray her panic, she spat out the words I had been waiting for. "I have nothing," she said, her tone filled with anger, disbelief, and something dangerously close to desperation. "I can't pay my rent, my credit cards are maxed out, and Mom and Dad don't have anything without you." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting her feel it, letting her realize that there was no sympathy in my expression, no warmth in my stance, no automatic offer of help coming her way. She had expected something, had expected me to react, to flinch, to ask her what she needed, to reassure her that of course I wouldn't let her suffer, to step in and save her the way I had unknowingly been saving her for years. But I didn't. I just let her stand there, let her words hang in the air between us, let her drown in the weight of her own reality. Lauren wasn't used to not getting what she wanted. She wasn't used to begging for anything. So when I said nothing, when I didn't react, when I didn't so much as blink, her composure cracked. She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head like she couldn't believe this was happening, like she still thought this was some kind of game I was playing, some kind of lesson I was trying to teach before ultimately caving. Then, when I still didn't respond, the laughter stopped, and the anger set in. "Oh, come on," she snapped, her voice rising slightly, her hands flying up in frustration. "You're really just gonna stand there like that? You're really going to act like you don't care? Like we're not family?" The word family tasted rotten coming from her mouth, and she must have seen something shift in my expression, because for the first time since she had arrived, she actually hesitated, her anger faltering just enough to let fear creep in. "Rachel," she tried again, this time softer, this time almost pleading. "I'm serious. I have nothing. I don't even know how I'm going to buy groceries next week." I let out a slow, deliberate breath, tilting my head slightly as I studied her, watching the way her fingers clenched into fists, the way her eyes darted to the floor before snapping back up to mine, the way she was struggling to accept that the dynamic had changed. For years, I had been the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who always cleaned up the messes she left behind. She had always known that no matter what she did, no matter how careless she was, no matter how badly she screwed up, there would be a safety net waiting to catch her. But not this time. I know, I said finally, my voice even, steady, mercilessly calm. And I don't care. She flinched like I had slapped her, her mouth parting slightly in shock, her entire body tensing like she had just realized she had no backup plan, no escape, no control over the situation. Lauren had never been powerless before. And now, she had no choice but to feel it. Her breathing picked up, her shoulders rising and falling too quickly, her face twisting into something ugly, something filled with rage, betrayal, and pure, unfiltered disbelief. "You're actually gonna let me end up on the street," she demanded, her voice shaking, her hands clenching at her sides. I held her gaze, my face unreadable, my pulse steady, my answer already decided. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't answer her right away, didn't react to the way her voice shook, didn't flinch at the sheer disbelief dripping from her words, didn't let myself feel anything at all. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let it linger between us like an open wound, let her sit in the unbearable weight of not knowing what I was going to say next. She had spent her entire life controlling conversations, controlling people, controlling outcomes, but now, for the first time, she was powerless, standing on my doorstep, begging instead of demanding, panicking instead of manipulating, realizing far too late that she had never actually been in control of anything at all. She shifted from foot to foot, her arms crossing, uncrossing, her fingers twitching, her breath uneven, her expression flickering between anger and fear as the seconds crawled by and I still hadn't spoken. She hated this, hated waiting, hated uncertainty, hated not knowing whether I was going to save her or let her fall. I took my time, took a slow, deliberate breath, took in the sight of her standing there with no more excuses, no more defenses, no more shields to hide behind, and then, finally, I tilted my head slightly, watching her with the same cold detachment she had always watched me with. "You want my help?" I asked, my voice calm, my tone carefully measured, my expression giving nothing away. Lauren exhaled sharply, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, her entire body vibrating with a frustration she didn't know how to control. Obviously, she snapped, her voice sharp, her words cutting, her pride still too big to let her actually admit what she needed from me. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." I nodded slightly, letting the moment hang, letting her think, just for a second, that maybe I was considering giving in, that maybe I was about to fix everything like I always had. Then, with a calmness that made her flinch, I gave her my one and only offer. "Get a job," I said, my voice even, my words slow and deliberate, letting each syllable sink into her skin like a blade. "Figure out how to take care of yourself. Work for what you want, pay your own bills, make your own way in the world, just like the rest of us do." The reaction was immediate. Her entire face twisted, her lips curling in disgust, her eyes narrowing, her hands flying up in disbelief like I had just said something offensive, something unreasonable, something that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "A job," she repeated, her voice laced with outrage, her eyebrows shooting up so high they practically disappeared into her hairline. "Are you serious?" "Rachel, I have no money," I cut in smoothly, my expression unreadable, my tone unwavering, my patience completely gone. "No savings. No backup plan. No one left to support you." "Yeah, I know." Lauren's mouth snapped shut, her teeth clicking together audibly, her nostrils flaring as she struggled, really struggled, to hold back whatever insult was about to spill out of her. She hated this. Hated being told no. Hated not being the center of someone's world. Hated the idea that she might actually have to work for something instead of just waiting for it to be handed to her. "You don't get it," she finally hissed, her voice shaking, her fingers curling into the fabric of her coat like she was trying to physically hold herself together. "Mom and Dad, I don't care," I said simply, cutting her off without hesitation, watching the way her entire body tensed at the realization that she wasn't going to be able to guilt me, manipulate me, or change my mind. Lauren opened her mouth again, then closed it, then shook her head, fuming, seething, cracking right in front of me. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. I pulled it out, glanced at the name flashing across the screen, and let out a short, humorless laugh. Mom. I held up the phone, let Lauren see it, let her watch as I hit decline without even thinking twice. They're freaking out, she said, her voice quieter now, her rage taking a back seat to something else, something that sounded suspiciously close to fear. I met her eyes, tilted my head slightly, felt nothing but clarity as I gave her my final answer. I was their retirement plan, I said, my voice steady, my decision final, my hand steady as I slid my phone back into my pocket. Now they can figure it out. Lauren inhaled sharply, her lips parting slightly, her body visibly deflating at the realization that there was nothing left for her here, no more safety net, no more free ride. No more older sister willing to fix everything just because she didn't want to see her fail. I let her sit in it, let her feel every ounce of the weight she had so carelessly thrown onto me for years, let her understand exactly what it meant to be responsible for yourself. And then, just as she turned to leave, just as she muttered something under her breath about how this was unbelievable, just as she took one last shaky breath and prepared to walk away, I reached into my purse, pulled out an envelope, and placed it in her hand. She looked down at it, hesitant, confused, suspicious, her fingers tightening around the edges like she wasn't sure if she should open it or throw it back in my face. Her voice was barely more than a whisper when she finally spoke. "What is this?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, my expression unreadable, my voice smooth as glass. "One last gift." Lauren stood there, gripping the envelope so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her expression frozen somewhere between desperate hope and absolute dread, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts as she tried to decide whether she even wanted to know what was inside. I could see the battle playing out in real time, could practically hear the thoughts racing through her mind, the endless loop of what-ifs running wild behind her glassy, wide-eyed stare. What if it was money? What if it was a check? What if it was proof that I hadn't really changed, that I was still the sister who would always, eventually, give in? What if this was her way out? What if this was her last chance to escape the consequences she had spent her entire life avoiding? She swallowed hard, hesitated for another long, agonizing moment, then finally tore the envelope open, her fingers shaking as she pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The tension in her shoulders shifted almost immediately, her lips parting slightly as her eyes scanned the page, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her grip on the paper tightening as if she thought maybe, just maybe, the words would change if she held on hard enough. But they wouldn't. Because there was only one sentence written on the page, only one final message left for her, only one thing she needed to hear from me before I walked away for good. "You'll figure it out." Just like I had to. Her entire body went still. For the first time since she had shown up at my door, she wasn't yelling, wasn't arguing, wasn't trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty, wasn't shifting blame onto everyone but herself. She just stood there, completely silent, staring at the page, her face blank, her breathing shallow, the weight of those words crashing down around her like a tidal wave she had never seen coming. I waited, watched, let the moment drag out, let her feel every bit of the reality she had spent her entire life pretending didn't exist. There was no escape this time, no backup plan, no last-minute safety net to catch her, no parent swooping in to fix it, no family member stepping up to take responsibility, no way to spin the narrative so she could come out on top. This time, she was on her own. She exhaled sharply, a choked sound slipping from the back of her throat, her fingers crumpling the edges of the page, her jaw tightening as her eyes darted up to meet mine, filled with something I had never seen in them before. Not anger, not entitlement, not the usual smug certainty that she would get her way, but something deeper, something raw, something dangerously close to fear. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice unsteady, almost pleading, almost small. "You're really doing this?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because it was already done. She let out a shaky breath, blinking rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to fight for one last chance, like she wanted to find the right words to undo everything. But there were no right words anymore, no magic phrases that would make me forget the years of neglect, the years of manipulation, the years of being used and discarded whenever it was convenient for them. And finally, she knew it. The realization hit her all at once, her body swaying slightly, her hands clenching at her sides, her lips pressing into a thin, wobbly line as she tried, and failed, to stop the way her face completely crumbled. Lauren broke. Right there on my doorstep, in the cold, in the silence, in the suffocating weight of her own mistakes, she finally, truly broke. I turned before she could say anything else, before she could try to pull me back in, before she could convince herself that tears and regret were enough to undo what had already been done. She needed to feel this. She needed to sit in this. She needed to understand exactly what it meant to be left with nothing, to start over from scratch, to learn the lessons that should have been taught to her years ago. And I needed to walk away. So I did. I didn't look back as I stepped inside, didn't watch her reaction as I closed the door, didn't let myself feel even a shred of guilt as I turned the lock, as I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years, as I let my forehead rest against the door and let the silence settle deep into my bones. For the first time in my life, I had nothing left to give them. And it felt good. I grabbed my keys, my purse, my coat, moving slowly, methodically, deliberately, letting my body settle into the unfamiliar, almost intoxicating feeling of being free. I stepped outside, the cold air biting against my skin, my breath curling in the night, my footsteps steady, confident, unburdened for the first time in as long as I could remember. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, gripped the wheel with steady hands, and let out a deep, controlled breath as the soft hum of the car surrounded me, wrapping me in something I hadn't realized I had been missing until this very moment: peace. No more late-night calls begging for money, no more guilt-tripping messages about how I was the only one who could help, no more feeling like my entire existence was tied to fixing other people's mistakes. I had spent my whole life taking care of them. Now, for the first time, I was finally taking care of me.